Hi everyone and welcome. I am joined today by Marta Havryshko, a PhD from Ivan Franko National University in Lviv in Ukraine, now teaching in Massachusetts in the United States, where you've been for part of the time since you left the war. Now, your research focuses on the Holocaust and also the Ukrainian ultranationalism. So, welcome to the program.
Welcome and thank you for having me today.
Um, well, I guess a good place to start is how did you end up pursuing a career in Ukrainian ultranationalism to begin with?
So my path was very, I believe, typical because I was born in Western Ukraine, in Galicia, near Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov. So I was surrounded by ultranationalism my entire life. I was indoctrinated in ultranationalist in my school. We teach a lot of songs that originated during, Second World War and were authored by Ukrainian nationalists. In our school, we celebrated Bandera, Shukhevich, and other members of Ukrainian nationalist movement. So it was very typical for me. And um, despite of the diverse ethnic background of my family, basically, this Ukraine identity was the most important and the most cultivated in my family. And also, I must admit that one part of my family, actually, from my mother's side, participated in Ukraine nationalist underground movement, and they were repressed by Soviets and sent to Gulag together with family members. So basically our family gatherings were also always connected to some stories about Soviet repressions, about Ukraine nationalism that suffered a lot, and Ukraine people who suffered at the head of Russians. So I decided to become a historian, and my dissertation was devoted to the satire and how Galician public, different, not only nationalists, but also, socialists, liberals, how they perceived the Third Reich in interwar period. After defense of my dissertation, I switched my attention to the Holocaust because during my research I learned a lot about anti-Jewish violence perpetrated by Ukrainian nationalist movement, and I started basically studying sexual violence perpetrated by members of Ukraine nationalist underground movement inside OUN and UPA, but also outside against civilian women, Ukrainian women, Polish women, Jewish women, and other women in Western Ukraine. And basically, right away, I started to be target of this criticism from my colleagues. Some of professors told me you should. It was basically it was after occupation of Crimea, so a lot of hostilities towards Russia developed in Western Ukraine. And some of my colleagues said to me, you should stop your research and wait until the end of the war. So basically, now we have 11 years of the war, and still I hear the same. You should wait, because your research undermined this bright image of Ukrainian nationals in the ground, and they should be celebrated as freedom fighters of those who fought for Ukraine independence. And their, these, dirty past, unwelcomed past should be hidden, should be silenced and marginalized. So basically, for me, it's very important. It was very important to understand how this myth about Ukrainian nationalism was created and how is this myth is preserved nowadays, not only in Western Ukraine, but also on the national level, because this myth is instrumentalized and weaponized to mobilize society to the war against Russia, to resist Russian aggression.
Well, we have a similar, I guess, demand for conformity during the war across the West because, again, before the war, especially before yeah, the war broke out in 2014, it was very common to recognize that there were very divided national identities in Ukraine. That is, different historical memories, how they viewed that, yeah, the time from Kievan Rus to the hundreds of years under in common state with the Russians, the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth. You had the, how do you remember the Soviet Union? So all of these things were very, very divided. And but then, of course, after 2022, especially, this was suddenly it became Russian propaganda overnight. That there was no divisions. The Ukrainians were, everyone on the same page. There were no far right. They were, they might have been fascist in the past, but now they're reformed, they're patriots, and everything was effectively whitewashed to the extent it became very, very awkward, at least in my opinion. But yeah, to take one step back, how can we understand these conflicting national identities in Ukraine? Because while they are complex, one doesn't want to oversimplify, but on the other hand, one kind of needs to chart it out somehow.
Yeah, so basically, we observed this division for a long time. After Ukraine gained independence, western part of Ukraine was developing this myth about Ukrainian nationalists on the ground as freedom fighters. And the main reason for that was living memory. There were, descendants of those people who fought for Ukrainian independence, who were members of Ukrainian nationalists on the ground, and their relatives, their grandchildren, they cherish this memory. And many of own Dupa fighters, they basically live in the Western Ukraine. That's why this memory was preserved, first of all, in the Western Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine and south of Ukraine had a different memory regime and memory culture. The main heroes of the World War II for those regions were not members of Ukrainian nationalists on the ground, but Red Army soldiers and Soviet partisans. And their heroic days when they fought Nazis were celebrated for a long time. So basically, this post-Soviet tradition of great patriotic war was more developed in these regions. And another reason for this memory clash between different regions was that Ukrainian nationalists collaborated with Nazis. And for example, some of them were members not only of UNEDUPA, but some of them were members of Waffen-SS Division Galicia, formed in 1943. And basically, the biggest battle of this division in July 1944 was in Brody, in Lviv region. And it was a battle that involved, on the one hand, Nazis, German forces, Wehrmacht, and Ukraine collaborators, and on the other hand, Red Army officers and soldiers. So basically, Ukrainians were divided between those two armies. That's why in eastern part of Ukraine, it was developed myth about, those Ukraine collaborators, those fascists, who basically fought our grandparents. So it was the clash between those two memory regimes. But what happened after February 2022? Ukraine government, it happened actually after Maidan, when Institute of National Memory was established and the memory laws were adopted. And according to these memory laws, those who were recognized as freedom fighters were, first of all, members of Ukrainian nationalists on the ground, and not Red Army soldiers. So basically, Red Army soldiers in post-Maidan Ukraine became a fallen heroes, and monuments to them, streets that commemorated their names, were erased from public space, and their places was taken by those members of Ukraine nationalists on the ground. They became new heroes. Why it happened? Because only one part of this history was very conventional for Ukraine government, and this part was connected to anti-Soviet struggle for independent Ukraine. So basically, Ukraine government made this link between Ukraine nationalists and the current Ukraine army. And many photo projects, different exhibitions, they basically made this direct link between Ukraine insurgent army and recent military. And that's why Ukraine government instrumentalized this myth about Ukraine nationalists. But they somehow, these memory actors, and first of all, state actors, they managed to silence completely the talk about the methods of this struggle. And those methods were very cruel, were very brutal, and involved the mass killing of civilians, children, women, men, Ukrainians, tens of thousands of Polish people in Galicia and Volyn, and also thousands of Jewish people who were hiding, in the forest, who were trying to avoid Nazi persecution. And another problem with Ukraine insurgent army and Ukraine nationalist movement during the Second World War is that many members of OUN and UPAR were basically Nazi collaborators. They were members of auxiliary police, of different Wehrmacht units, different police battalions, different administrative organs in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. So they were directly involved in Nazi war crimes, and in particular in the Holocaust. So you can't just take one part of this, heroic story, fighting for Ukraine independence, and just hide another part. You should embrace the entire story, which is very complex and very uncomfortable. But what Ukrainian government is doing, they completely silence these memory actors. They completely silence this involvement in Nazi crimes, or justify this. So basically what they are doing, they are portraying Nazi Germany as lesser evil than Soviet Union. And Soviet Union nowadays is portrayed as occupational regime, and Red Army soldiers are portrayed as victims of this regime or even collaborators. That's why the memory about them is erased, is silenced. They are basically forgotten nowadays. Those who are most celebrators are Nazi collaborators. And nowadays, this erasure of memory about the Red Army soldiers, Red Army heroes, is sometimes very ridiculous. Recently, Red Army veteran Olga Tverdokhlebova, she died. She was a very old woman. So basically, mainstream Ukrainian media, they described that she was a scout during the war, that she was a veteran, and she celebrated the end of the war in Berlin. But they failed to mention in which army she actually served during the Second World War. So basically, young Ukrainian youth that knew nothing about the World War II, I mean, teenagers, for example, when they read this article, for them it's very difficult even to understand in which army this heroic woman actually fought and celebrated this victory over Nazism. Another problem is connected to the celebration of Nazi collaboration, like Waffen-SS Division Galicia. Very often I hear this argument that because of the Jewish background of President Zelensky, Ukraine hasn't not so-called Nazi problem. So there is no celebration of Nazis in Ukraine, and neo-Nazis can't exist under Zelensky leadership. But what we have, the first march that commemorate Waffen-SS Division Galicia outside the Western Ukraine, where this cult was flourishing in 1990s even, the first march in Kyiv, in the Ukraine's capital, was organized in 2021 under Zelensky presidency. And what happened next? We all remember this Hunka scandal. I hope that our viewers remember Hunka scandal when veteran of Offenses Division Galicia was celebrated in Canadian Parliament and received standing ovation. And Zelensky was a part of this ceremony. He was present there, and he also gave this standing ovation. But then, when people figure out that this guy actually was a Nazi collaborator, it was a huge political scandal in Canada. But what happened in Ukraine? Office of the President started to whitewash Division Galicia. They started to talk about, that they fought for Ukraine independence and they never involved in war crimes. And they repeated all this myth about, Nuremberg trial, that they were not, put on trial, Nuremberg trial. And then they mentioned the Shen Commission and all these post-war, very politicized matters. But the problem with Waffen-SS Division Galicia, that they basically were involved in war crimes. They participated in punitive actions in former Yugoslavia and Slovakia in 1994, 1945. After this defeat in the Battle of Brode in 1944, many members of different police units who participated in the Holocaust, for example, who participated in massacre in Polish villages like Huta Peniacka and other villages, they joined Division Waffen-SS Galicia. So basically, they were part of this division, these Nazi collaborators with blood on their hands. So you can celebrate them as freedom fighters, as those who fought for Ukraine independence, because they pay allegiance to Hitler and they basically fulfill the political and military goals of the Nazi Germany, not Ukraine state. And right, in those days when this scandal in Canada was unfolding, the Azov Third Assault Brigade organized a photo exhibition in one of the major museums in Ukraine, in Kyiv, where they celebrated this Division Galicia. And the Ukraine government, Ukraine officials were present there. And then they showed this exhibition in Lithuania on the Ukraine Independence Day. So basically, Ukraine state actors supported this glorification. And what we observe now, so many units in Ukraine armed forces in recent day, because it was anniversary on 28th of April, anniversary of creation of Waffen-SS Division Galicia, units that were formed on the basis of far-right groups like Vovki da Vinci, like Karpatska Sich, like, different Azov units, I mean Azov Brigade and Third Assault Brigade, they openly celebrate Waffen-SS Division Galicia. They openly teach their soldiers, subordinates, and their youth about the heroic deeds of this division. So basically, it's very problematic developments because we hear, that Ukraine is fighting for European values, for democracy. What kind of democracy can bring celebration of Nazi crimes? It's a poor Nazi apology and Nazi revisionism, which is very troubling development nowadays in Ukraine.
Well, that's the thing with Ukrainian nationalism. I can appreciate that if well for Ukrainians, then especially in Western Ukraine, who considers Ukrainians to be distinctively different from Russians culturally and wants this to be the foundation of statehood, that is national sovereignty. That makes sense. Also, I guess from a you don't want to be too close, too similar to Russia. If you're identical to Russians, why be a sovereign state to begin with? So it becomes actually a security challenge. So I can appreciate all of this, but the representing it by linking Ukrainian nationalism so close to German fascism. This is a strange thing. And again, I'm not saying that it's all the nationalists in Ukraine, but indeed, one sees that it's a minority. It's a rather small minority as well. That is the people celebrating Bandera, and the Nazi collaborators as national heroes and freedom fighters. But something that the former advisor of Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, noted. He argued that how could they have captured the entire nation? Because at the moment, he argued, even though a small minority, they have acquired a huge influence over Ukraine in terms of dictating, again, what the national identity should be, telling the national story. And again, he's quite pessimistic about this because it's very divisive. It's millions of people who become second-rate citizens, and under this, especially during a war, it's quite a disastrous way to undermine such huge part of your own population. But how can you explain this though? Why such a small minority was able to hijack the agenda, or I guess the national consciousness, if you will, of the entire nation?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very important question because we often hear this argument that, political scientists and some, advocates of Ukraine in the West often rely on this argument that, far-right parties never gain substantial, representation in Ukraine parliament. They didn't, that they only had, in the last parliamentary elections, they gained only 2% of votes. So, and for them, it's an argument that far rights in Ukraine don't have substantial support, but it's not true, actually. Ukraine politics and Ukraine democracy, let's say in quoting marks, of course, operates in different modality than Western countries. We observe after Maidan this, wave of so-called vigilantism, when far rights were trying use, and they used heavily street violence, physical violence, to threaten different politicians, to threaten activists, for example, leftist activists, those politicians who were portrayed as so-called pro-Russian politicians. Nowadays, we observe how they, try to seize entire churches, and they use physical violence to when they attack, for example, these churches of Moscow Patriarchate. And we hear this from, different politicians, that they are afraid, basically, of those far right. They threaten them and threaten their family members, including children. This is how far rights have influence in Ukraine, by using violence. And it's very similar to Weimar Republic. When it was in crisis, democracy was very weak, like in Ukraine, many economic problems, many, these sentiments about, stab in the back myth. So nationalists, they gain support by cultivating all those sorrows, national, and national frustration, economic crisis, and so on and so forth. And basically, I believe that Russian attack on Ukraine on February 2022 was a big, gift to Ukraine far right. Why? Because many of them who were previously put in prison by Poroshenko and then even by Zelensky for participating, for attacking police, for participating in, these violent activities, they were released from prison. And even those who were participating in criminal or semi-criminal activities, because we know that they were engaged in this, business, let's say, with with different gangs. So basically, they were immediately released from prison because of the lack of power. They received weapon and they received support from the state. So basically, it was a toxic alliance that we observe nowadays. So basically, they were empowered by Ukraine state because of the lack of manpower and because of this existential threat from Russia, that this attack was portrayed as existential threat, and all those guys were just empowered. But what else contributed to this? What else? Support of the West. We observe how changed the media narrative in the West regarding, for example, Azov. Azov changed ideology? No. Azov heavily relies on ethnic Ukrainian nationalists. They are very open about rights of national minorities. They are very open about, for example, the status of Crimea. They have very open anti-Roma rhetoric. Some of them express anti-Semitic views very openly. They are relying on this, ideology crafted by ideologists of Ukraine integral nationalists. I mean, Dmytro Dontsov, Mykola Mikhnovsky, Yuri Lipa, which includes elements of anti-Semitism, elements of racism, and they talk about dictatorship. They talk about, one party. They talk about strong leader. They talk that they are very open about, their homophobia. So basically, they are not pro-democratic forces, and their ideology is still the same. They still use the same symbols. And nowadays, for example, the Third Assault Brigade, they even crafted, the flag and the wars with Derlewanger, this notorious Derlewanger Waffen-SS brigade that was, involved in heavy war crimes. Some of them use Totenkopf, some of them use, Azov still, they just transformed little bit a Volksangle symbol basically. So they didn't give up their ideology. Their ideology is the same like it was 10 years ago when they were heavily criticized. But Western media, this mainstream media, legacy media, they basically contributed to this changing image of far right in Ukraine. They call them, freedom fighters, activists, nationalists, patriots. They portray them as devoted fighters who are ready to sacrifice their life. So basically, mainstream media are responsible also for this, shifting, for shift in this discourse. But also, what we observe, Biden administration actually, as we know, lifted the ban on delivery weapon to Azov. And but what changed? One of the arguments why Azov shouldn't have American weapon was that they are training American neo-Nazis. And what we observe, they still train American neo-Nazis, and some of them actually send me a death threats. And nowadays, I am cooperating with local police and local FBI in order to track them and in order to put them on trial. So Azov still incorporates so many foreign fighters, and many of them are far right. They are white supremacists. They are neo-Nazis because they are thirsty of training, military training. They want to gain this training. That's why Ukraine became a paradise for them, a space place where they have protection, where they have social benefits and even celebrated as freedom fighters. And also we have some experts they say, that are openly saying, Western experts actually, who are openly saying, Azov changed because Azov was incorporated into, state armed forces. No, Azov didn't change ideology. Azov gained a lot of power nowadays because yes, it created more units like Kraken under military intelligence supervision. It divided, we have now Brigade Azov and the Third Assault Brigade. So they basically they gain even more power, and nobody asked their ask tough questions about their tattoo. Nobody asked tough question about their ideology. Recently, Ukraine media that was sponsored by USAID for a long time created a documentary about Azov, and I expected that they will talk about those neo-Nazis, Misanthropic Division, for example, Patriot of Ukraine, National Socialist Assembly, that created Azov, that they will talk about their ideology, about their, anti-racist rhetoric and anti, ethnic violence they perpetrated in Ukraine. I expected that they will interview at least Russian neo-Nazis who were at the beginning of Azov, like Lyovkin, for example, whose band has the title Hitler's Hammer, and who in war-torn country Ukraine openly organized concerts for its followers, where participants are making Nazi salute, and he was teaching race theory for Azov members, but nobody asked him even a question. I expected that, other members of so-called Format 18, and 18 stands for Adolf Hitler. This group, it was a neo-Nazi group formed in Russia, and was led by Marcinkevich, nicknamed Tesak. And after his death, many of them escaped to Ukraine. And this group committed numerous crimes, including killing of people out of racial hatred. And they ended up in Azov, and they are serving now in Azov. And their bodies are covered with, Hitler, Totenkopf, swastika, and they are very open about their abuse. They mock Holocaust survivors on Holocaust Remembrance Day. They talk about the white race, and they are fighting for white Europe. So they are very open on their social media, and they have tens of thousands of followers, and nobody questioned them. And in this documentary created by Ukraine, we don't have even once, that those guys were mentioned, and their contribution to the ideology of this movement is not even mentioned. So I have a lot of questions to Ukrainian journalists and to Western journalists. What are you doing? Why are you not questioning those guys? Where is your investigative journalism? Why nowadays, for example, Russian volunteer corps led by Nikitin, Denis Nikitin, nicknamed White Rex. He was expelled from Germany for extremist activity. He received Schengen-wide ban to enter. He can't even leave Ukraine because he's considered as extremist and neo-Nazi. But in Ukraine, he is invited by mainstream media and portrayed as a freedom fighter. But look at his social media. He's celebrating Hitler's birthday, openly. And his guys are wearing parts celebrating Vlasov army, Russian Nazi collaborators. Look at, German volunteer corps, who nowadays became a part of Karpatska Sich, in the part of Ukraine armed forces. Their social media, their Telegram channel is, Nazi apology. It's celebration of Nazi leaders and, Holocaust humor, basically. So anti-Semitism is present heavily there, but nobody questioned them. So basically, the bottom line is that Ukraine political elites and Western political elites basically change their narrative and change approach to far right in order to instrumentalize them and use them to bleed and weaken Russia, because they know that those guys are most aggressive and are most thirsty of war. And they are indoctrinated and socializing violence, and they are ready to use violence, and they already used violence in the Donbas war in 14, 15, 16. So we have a lot of, different reports of human rights organization about numerous war crimes perpetrated by Azov and other far-right groups like, private sector or like, Battalion OUN and other guys. Tornado, for example, this notorious battalion, their crimes were so huge against local population, civilians, torture, murder, kidnapping, rape. So even Ukraine government under Poroshenko put him on trial, and they were in 2017, and they were sentenced to different imprisonment terms from 5 to 11. But what happened in 2022? They all were released. So now they are freedom fighters decorated with all social benefits. That's why it's a huge problem. It reminds me, the situation in Afghanistan. So basically, when US, West, basically, and Great Britain, they empowered these mujahideen, they empowered these far-right extremists and called them freedom fighters and celebrated them. But then they turned on their masters, and they played a huge role in all this, turmoil and human rights violation and constant war in Afghanistan. So basically, I am not optimistic about the fate of Ukraine in terms of influence of far right in Ukraine.
On them being a minority, though, this is interesting because if you see Poroshenko initially, he was pushing back against the nationalists. He was even Parliament voted for implementing the Minsk peace agreement, and it was only after the violence of the extreme right, which was then he was reversing it, and then of course his popularity went down, and then Zelensky won the election in 2019 on a peace platform, and again the threats against him, they were so open. In the Ukrainian media, they put it, the videos of him being threatened in Zolote on the front line there. Everything was, filmed. It was put in the media. They wrote about it. People from parliament, Yarosh, all these people openly threatened his life if he dared to implement the peace agreement. It is quite, yeah, it is quite shocking indeed. We also saw some Ukrainian NGOs, which are financed by Western governments, even putting forward these red lines. If you dare to implement any of the things you've said, pretty much, yeah, you will have to answer to us. This is a red line, and it was all financed by various Western governments. It's quite shocking, but yeah, I think the reason why it's such an eagerness in the West to whitewash it is, yeah, one, of course, they're a useful instrument because they might be a minority, but they're good fighters. They're motivated. They will not make any compromises. They will, it's a little bit like after World War II. They were a good anti-communist group, I guess, to ally with. Um, but it is concerning. I mean, you mentioned previously the Canadian Parliament, but it was similar in the Danish Parliament. They had an Azov fighter who was celebrated there, and he had on his social media he'd advocated for Mein Kampf. He listed his hometown as Babi Yar. He wore the Wolfsangel, the emblem, the fascist symbol, and they still give him a standing ovation. It's quite surprising. Even in the British Parliament, Boris Johnson hosted Azov fighters and held up the Azov flag, which consists of the black sun and the wolfangel, both yeah, the fascist symbols of World War II, in the British Parliament. I mean, Churchill must be rolling in his grave. This is just it's quite shocking. And I remember before 2022, you had in German newspapers they were criticizing that these slogans we hear now, this Slava Ukraina, wasn't this what they said during World War II, the fascists, and there
Yeah.
was some criticism. But after 2022, you have the Germans and the EU leadership chanting Slava Ukraini again. Everything that they were reporting from their own mouths a few months earlier suddenly was all thrown away. And even the leader of Azov,
Zelensky.
Bieletsky,
Mhm.
he's been in British newspaper because he argued that the historic commission of the Ukrainian nation should be to lead the white race of the world for a crusade against the Semite Untermenschen. And again, this is it's not as if this comes out of Russian media. This is this is reported. It's there. It's reported already in the British media. But then, of course, the war, the Russians invade, and now, no, he's reformed now. Now he's one of us. I mean, he's a liberal Democrat. I think it's just you're either one or the other. So if you're fighting Russia, then you're on the good, then you're a good guy. And no, it's it's quite shocking. Well, again, the point I was going to was given that the radical right had this ability to essentially be a veto power over any compromise with the Russians. Now we seem to be reaching a point in the war where things are going from bad to worse for Ukraine, and the Americans, I think they can see what is coming, so they are pulling out and leaving this mess for the Europeans. But it begs the question if Zelensky can actually sign any peace deal without being lynched by the extreme right. How do you see this? Is it possible, or how would they react to any peace deal? I can't imagine there being any acceptance. On the other hand, if the alternative is collapse, and the destruction of Ukraine as a nation, it just, you know, there must be some reason there to pick the lesser of two evil, I thought.
Um, um, uh, Actually, I'm very concerned about this threats from far right because we remember that, this no capitulation, this movement, Poroshenko was part of this movement, but also Azov was heavily involved in this movement. And they already threatened Zelensky. And to my understanding, Zelensky is trying to buy leaders, basically to buy their loyalty. How they gave them diplomatic, for example, support. They gave them financial support. I must say that Azov units are most celebrated nowadays in Ukraine, and they are most present in the media. So basically, they give them a lot of credit. And I believe that this cooperation, one reason for this cooperation is that Zelensky is afraid that they will use violence against him and his inner circle. But another reason could be because of their very radical rhetoric, Zelensky can always say, the main decision makers should be those guys, who are fighting, who are on the front line. They know situation very well. And if they are saying that we have chances, it means that we have chances and we will continue fight. So basically for them, there will be always an excuse how to prolong war, how to sabotage peace negotiations, how and for Zelensky, to my understanding, for Zelensky, it's very important to keep power. Why? One of the reasons is not only his, desire to have this influence, to be celebrated, and as he was celebrated at the beginning of the, Russian full-scale invasion. But the problem is that if he will be removed from power, I believe there will be a lot of investigations because many people are furious that he didn't organize evacuation of people from Mariupol, for example, or from Bucha and other localities close to the border. So basically, many people lost their property, lost their lives, lost their, health. Many were killed. Even children were not evacuated. Then Zelensky explained that it was for purpose because he didn't want to create this panic, but they knew all these, plans of Russians. But many people really feel betrayed. And nowadays, a lot of corruption scandals surround his inner circle and people close to him. Former, for example, Minister of Defense, other people who were appointed by him. That's why it's one of the reasons why he afraid of presidential elections new, and why he afraid to lose power. And in order to keep power, the martial law should be in place, so the war should be in place. That's why he is one of the biggest, profiteers of basically of prolonging this war. And I believe that it could be an alliance between him and those far right groups. And I must say that recently we learned that some prominent commanders of Azov received the lead as a gift from one of the Ukraine oligarchs who is now very close to Zelensky. I mean, Akhmedov received elite apartments in Kyiv. So basically, they received additional motivation, let's say, how to support Zelensky. And I am following different far-right groups and their activities and their internal discussions. And they are part of extreme right who are unhappy with this behavior because they believe, because of the Jewish background of Zelensky, they believe that Bieletsky himself and the leadership of the Azov movement betrayed the racist ideas, because they are serving Jews, basically. Yes, so nowadays there is a division even inside these, extreme rights in Ukraine. But of course, majority of them are interested in cooperation with the state and in cooperation with political elites. Why? Because they gain enormous influence and power. Many of them, didn't have, career, didn't have the social standing that they have now. And now they, celebrated, they have, good salary, they invited, they are, they have the state protection. So basically they enjoy their privileges now. And they portray themselves as a privilege, as an elite. They constantly talking about, that this military elite should have the preferences in the state, and they openly are talking about stripping of some civil rights of men who are not fighting, who are not in the military. So they are against this, against the very idea of equal civil rights for all citizenship. That's why for them war is a paradise. War is a time when they are flourishing. That's why in this regard, I believe that Zelensky can, so the interests of far rights and the interests of Zelensky and his team are, intertwined in this. So all of them wants war, more war, because they are profiting from this war. And many of those commanders, they are far from the battlefield. They are safe, they're in Kyiv, they are very present in media, so they send youth. That's why Azov, for example, they created a law, they created this Centuria youth, and they have branches in all major Ukrainian cities. And one of my friends told me that his son visiting this Centuria training is very violent. It's, promote toxic masculinity. It's promote, this physical force, self-sacrifice, this nationalism. And he told me it's like, some cult. It's like a religion. And his son, who is 18 years old, said to him that he will sign a contract immediately. This is basically how Azov is luring this young men to the military. They indoctrinate them, that they have this ideological training. They create for them this feeling of, brotherhood, this, support, this. So basically, they have, and the problem is that Azov nowadays, thanks to support of the state, that they have access to the public schools. where they perform so-called lessons of courage. So basically, they openly promote their ideology while performing some, basic training, for example, medical training or some basic military training. But all of them are allowed to school, and some of them are going to school with, Volksangel symbols, Totenkopf, and other hate symbols. And they advertise their use, and in this way they attract more and more young people who, after turning 18, are, convinced basically that they should join Ukraine military and, experience glorious death, sacrifice their life to the nation. So basically, we have indoctrination, like in different fascist states, it's a poor indoctrination.
It's, I remember before 2014, yeah, I couldn't imagine Russians and Ukrainians actually fighting each other, and now this has become the new normal. It's suddenly, yeah, of course they will. There's this suddenly common sense. Remember even Lavrov made that argument once that Ukrainians aren't Polish. They do not hate Russians. This is now I think this will take yeah, decades and decades to overcome. My last question was just on how you see the World War II being used in the war narratives, because it appears that it's not just Ukraine, also Russia leans very heavily into World War II in order to frame the war. I mean, all countries tend to do this again, not just Ukraine and Russia, but to yeah to kind of root the present conflicts in those of the past in order to indeed I would say here in the West as well we seem to believe that we're fighting Adolf Hitler again, that this is the new in the form of Russia. Well, we always fight the new Hitler when we go to war, but yeah, anyways, Ukraine and Russia, they both yeah, lean very heavily into the World War II narrative. So, but of course, in very different ways. How do you make sense of this?
So basically, the memory and the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust is very present in this informational war. We remember how Putin, in his angry speech on 24th October, how he mentioned so-called denazification among the main aims of so-called special military operation. And we remember how he portrayed, even, it's very anti-Semitic actually method. He portrayed Zelensky as not true Jew. Yeah, and then Lavrov used the same, and Medvedev used the same in their rhetoric, very similar. And Solovyov, a top propagandist and TV host, he also portrayed Zelensky as a traitor of Jewish people and not real Jew, and said he's the Nazi pig. Yeah, so basically this narrative of Nazis in Ukraine, Nazi regime in Ukraine was very useful for Kremlin political elites because it's fulfilled two main aims. First of all, we must remember, we must keep in mind that the memory of the Великая Отечественная война, the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War, plays a huge role in national identity of Russians today. We all know all these, commemorations on the Victory Day in schools, in different cultural places, on political level. So basically, when you're talking about Nazi regime, that is in Ukraine nowadays. You invoke this memory about the Second World War. You invoke this memory of the great grandparents who fought bravely against Nazis. So basically, you are trying to why Putin is doing this, because he's trying to explain to ordinary Russians why Russia attacked Ukraine. Because we, as descendant of Soviet Union, we have this sacred mission to fight Nazis. Yes, and the second goal for him, internal goal, is to mobilize men. You should fight like your father, like your grandfather. Yes, because you should honor his memory and and continue his mission. But the other goal is actually similar to the goal that you described, Glenn. It's for external use. It's the aim is to justify also for international public why Russia attacked Ukraine. Yeah, because it's a Nazi regime, and the memory about Nazi crimes also is foundation of this culture of remembrance in Europe after the Second World War. So when you are talking about Nazi crimes, Nazism, and talk about Hitler, you also invoke this trauma and this memory. So on the one hand, you justify war, but also you can justify, for example, destruction of Ukraine infrastructure, bombing residential areas, bombing hospitals. Why? Because you want to defeat the ultimate evil, Nazism, like during the Second World War, alien forces bombed Dresden or Berlin. It was a byproduct, but it was inevitable when you want to defeat evil. So that's why Russia instrumentalized this World War II narrative. And we see that many Russian soldiers, they carry, Georgian St. George strip, or they, carry Soviet flags. So I want to point out that maybe our viewers know that during Victory Day, in many Russian cities, there is this commemoration march, Immortal Regiment, when people are marching and carrying portraits of their grandfathers and grandmothers who died in the Second World War or survived the Second World War, but they were fighting Nazis. And after 2022, some participants of these events, they started to carry portraits of soldiers who are fighting in Ukraine or who died in Ukraine's war, meaning they are making this direct link between the Second World War and the current war in Ukraine. So basically, the entire memory is instrumentalized to justify Russian aggression, and it was pointed out by different cultural organizations, memory that deal with the memory of the Second World War and the Holocaust. For example, USHMM, Anti-Defamation League, many Holocaust scholars, genocide scholars, they condemn this instrumentalization and distortion of the history and memory of the Second World War by Putin's regime in order to justify a crime, a war of aggression against Ukraine. But on the other hand, we have Ukraine. From Ukraine's side, the same instrumentalization and the same weaponization of the Second World War. We remember address of Zelensky to Knesset in spring 2022. And many Israeli people and many Jewish people were outraged, were furious when Zelensky said, at the end, he said the phrase that Ukrainians made their choice during the Second World War and they rescued Jews. And then he stopped, but he never mentioned even once that Ukrainians participated in the Holocaust. They were hunting Jews. They participated in Nazi crimes against Jewish people. So it was, and I remember when Ukraine army entered Bucha and all those, dead bodies were discovered and all these, investigations were published. Many Ukrainians started to share this concept that Bucha is Ukraine Baben Yar. Baben Yar is a symbol of Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe, because in Baben Yar, in this ravine, in September 1941, almost 34,000 Jews were killed by Nazis. Among them, many elderly people, many women and children, because many men were drafted to the Red Army at that time. But this false comparison, it's a Holocaust distortion. you can't compare these crimes because you desecrate the memory of those Jewish victims, you know. But Ukraine is always, Ukraine memory actors, both state actors and non-state actors, they constantly invoke this memory of the Second World War. But what part of this memory? Part when Ukraine nationalists on the ground, Ukraine or Organization of Ukraine Nationalists and Ukraine Insurgent Army fought for Ukraine independence. And nowadays, what we see, Ukraine Ministry of Defense, for example, they created recently they created an exhibition about Ukraine military tradition, and the Red Army, in which millions of Ukrainians served and fought Nazis, and millions died, and millions were, heavily wounded. They disappeared from this Ukraine military tradition. And the link is to Ukrainian insurgent army, and why it's dangerous? Because it's basically also part of Holocaust distortion, Nazi revisionism, and denial of ethnic cleansing and war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by OUN and UPA. And it's very dangerous development because never again should be universal. It should be universal for every single person on our earth, and not only for some groups. That's why I believe it's very dangerous instrumentalization on both sides, and we should pay attention to this distortion.
It's a common theme though in all countries that if the government gets to claim ownership over representing past generations' war memory, that they will always be instrumental in the recruitment of next generation to send them to the front. Indeed, in Russia, this was part of the idea behind, if I'm not mistaken, of showing pictures of your family members, that public should claim ownership over their own historical memory of war, because if you don't have, if you outsource it to governments, they will use it to to bring the next generation to
Yes.
the slaughterhouse. So it is an interesting, yeah, something I noticed in most wars actually. So
Yeah.
anyways, thank you so much for your time. I have many more questions in my head, but we will have to do it, I guess, some other time. So thanks
Yes,
again.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Glenn, for the invitation. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.